The city stretched endlessly beneath him, a glittering empire of glass and steel, alive even at this hour but distant, untouchable. Rain slid down the towering windows of the penthouse in slow, deliberate streaks, blurring the skyline into something almost abstract, like a painting that had lost its meaning. Dante Morty stood still in the center of it all, a solitary figure in a world he owned but no longer felt. 50 years had carved him into something unbreakable, a man who didn't ask twice, a man who didn't lose. He had built Morty Global from nothing but instinct, calculation, and a ruthless understanding of how power truly worked. Competitors didn't defeat him. They disappeared, absorbed, dismantled, erased. Boardrooms bent to him. Markets shifted because of him. Governments listened when he spoke. There was no room for weakness in a life like his. And yet tonight, the silence pressed against him like something alive. It wasn't the kind of silence he controlled, the quiet of a sealed deal, the calm after a successful acquisition. This silence was different, heavy, uneasy, the kind that settled into his chest and refused to leave, the kind that reminded him of something he had spent 20 months trying not to think about. Elena. Her name moved through his mind like a ghost he couldn't outrun. Elena Rossi, 28, too young for him, too bright for the world he lived in. She had walked into his life without permission and left the same way, without explanation, without warning, without even looking back. And he had let her go. That was the part that still burned. Dante lifted the glass of whiskey in his hand but didn't drink. The amber liquid caught the faint glow of the city lights, trembling slightly as his grip tightened. He remembered the last night he saw her, the way she looked at him like he was something dangerous and something she couldn't survive. There had been words she didn't say, truths she buried behind silence, and then she was gone. No calls, no messages, just absence. He had searched for her. Not publicly, not recklessly, but quietly with the same precision he used in business. Discreet investigators, financial traces, digital footprints, nothing. It was as if she had erased herself from the world. Eventually, he stopped. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood something about control. Some things couldn't be forced. Some people couldn't be owned. Still, the silence she left behind had never truly gone away. A sharp crack of thunder echoed across the sky, vibrating faintly through the glass walls. Dante's gaze remained fixed on the storm, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. 20 months, 600 days, and not a single answer. The phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Dante didn't move immediately. His eyes shifted slowly toward the device resting on the marble table behind him. Midnight calls were never good. In his world, they meant only 3 things: loss, betrayal, or crisis. He had learned long ago that nothing urgent ever came wrapped in calm. The phone continued to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. He turned, setting the whiskey glass down with quiet precision, and walked toward it. Each step was measured, controlled, but something beneath that control had already begun to shift. He picked up the phone, his expression unreadable, his voice steady when he answered. "Morty." There was a pause on the other end, a breath uncertain, nervous. "Sir, I'm calling from St. Helena Private Hospital." Dante's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't speak. "My name is Dr. Marin," the voice continued, trembling just enough to be noticed. "We have a patient here, and your name was listed as the emergency contact." That didn't make sense. Dante never allowed his name to be attached to anything personal, never allowed anyone access to that part of him. There were no exceptions. "Who?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something colder. Another pause. And then, "Elena Rossi." The world didn't shatter. It didn't explode. It simply stopped. The name echoed in the silence, heavier than the storm outside, heavier than the years that had passed. Dante didn't realize his grip had tightened until the phone creaked faintly in his hand. For a moment, he said nothing, could say nothing, because the past he had buried wasn't buried at all. It was standing right in front of him again. Alive. "What happened to her?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now but far more dangerous. "She's stable," the doctor said quickly, "but she was admitted after collapsing. Severe exhaustion, stress, she's been through a lot." Dante closed his eyes for a brief second, steadying something inside himself that threatened to break through. And then the doctor spoke again. "Sir, there's something else." A pause. A hesitation that shouldn't have existed. Dante's eyes opened slowly. "Say it." The words came out softer, careful, as if they carried weight. "She had your child." Silence. Not the kind he feared. Not the kind he controlled. This was something else entirely. Something deeper. Something that changed everything. The drive to St. Helena Private Hospital felt longer than any negotiation Dante Morty had ever endured, longer than any war he had fought across boardrooms and markets, longer than the 20 months he had spent pretending Elena Rossi no longer existed. Rain battered the windshield in relentless waves, distorting the city into streaks of light and shadow, but he didn't slow down. He didn't think. For the first time in years, control slipped, not in his actions but in his thoughts. A child, his child. The words echoed in his mind, sharp, unreal, impossible to process. He had spent decades ensuring that nothing in his life existed without intention, without strategy, without awareness. And yet somehow, somewhere, a part of him had lived in breath for 20 months without his knowledge. The realization unsettled him in a way no rival ever had. When the car came to a halt beneath the sterile glow of the hospital entrance, Dante was already out before the engine fully died, his presence cutting through the quiet like something inevitable. The sliding doors opened, and the scent of antiseptic and polished floors replaced the storm, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. People noticed him instantly. They always did. Not because they knew his face, though many did, but because power had a way of announcing itself without words. The receptionist began to speak, something about visiting hours, about protocol, but Dante didn't stop. He didn't need to raise his voice. "Elena Rossi, room." The firmness in his tone erased any resistance, and within seconds directions were given, hesitation replaced by instinctive compliance. The elevator was too slow, so he took the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last, his heartbeat matching the rhythm in a way that felt unfamiliar, unwelcome. Dante Morty did not rush. He did not react. He anticipated, calculated, controlled. But now he was walking into something he had never prepared for. By the time he reached the 4th floor, his breath was steady, his face composed, but beneath that calm was something dangerous, something shifting. He stopped outside room 407, his hand hovering near the door, and for the first time in years, hesitation crept in. Not fear of loss, not fear of death, something far worse, the fear of something real. He pushed the door open. The room was dim, quiet except for the soft hum of machines, the kind of silence that carried fragility rather than control. His eyes found her immediately. Elena lay on the hospital bed, pale but unmistakably herself, her dark hair spread across the pillow like it had been the night she left him. For a moment, everything else faded, the empire, the years, the anger, the unanswered questions. She looked smaller than he remembered, not weaker, but worn, like life had demanded too much of her without giving anything back. And then his gaze shifted. That was when everything changed. In the chair beside her, curled into the soft curve of her arm, was a child. A little girl no older than 2, her small body wrapped in quiet sleep, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing in the world she trusted. Dante didn't move, couldn't. Something in his chest tightened in a way that was unfamiliar, unwelcomed, undeniable. He had seen countless things in his life, success, betrayal, destruction, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. The child's dark curls framed her face, her features soft, innocent, untouched by the world he ruled. And yet, there was something in her that struck him with quiet force. Recognition. He stepped closer, slow, almost cautious, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment. His eyes traced her face, every detail imprinting itself into him with brutal clarity. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her lips, the stillness in her expression. She looked like him. Not entirely, not in a way that erased Elena, but enough that there was no room for doubt, no room for denial. The truth stood in front of him, breathing, real, undeniable. His daughter. The word formed in his mind, heavy and foreign, yet fitting in a way nothing else ever had. Dante Morty, a man who controlled everything, who built an empire from nothing, who feared nothing, stood there unable to move because of a sleeping child. His hands that had signed deals worth billions, that had ended companies and shaped industries, remained at his sides. He didn't touch her. Not yet. Not because he didn't want to, but because something inside him told him he didn't deserve to. Dante. The voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it anchored him instantly. He turned, and Alina was looking at him, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion but filled with something deeper, something that hadn't faded in 20 months. Recognition, relief, fear. "You came," she whispered. He swallowed, the weight of everything pressing down on him at once. "You called." Her gaze softened, but there was tension beneath it, something unresolved, something waiting. Slowly, her eyes shifted toward the little girl beside her, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something fragile and unbreakable at the same time. "She's yours." The words settled into the room like a quiet explosion. Dante's eyes moved back to the child, his chest tightening as reality fully took hold. Every unanswered question, every empty night, every piece of silence, it all led here, to this moment, to her. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual edge. Alina's lips curved faintly, a soft, tired smile that held both love and exhaustion. "Arya." "Arya?" The name echoed through him, anchoring something that had never existed before. He repeated it in his mind, committing it to memory as if it were the most important thing he had ever learned, because it was. But then Alina's expression changed. The softness flickered, replaced by something darker, fear. "Dante," she said again, her voice trembling slightly, "they know." The air shifted. He didn't ask who, he didn't need to. The look in her eyes told him everything. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't fate bringing them back together. This was something else. Something dangerous. Dante straightened slowly, his entire presence shifting in an instant. The man who had walked into this room searching for answers was gone. In his place stood the man the world feared, controlled, calculating, unstoppable. Then they've already made a mistake. His gaze moved between Alina and Arya, something cold and absolute settling into his expression, something that left no room for doubt. Because this time, it wasn't about power. It was about what was his. And Dante Morty did not lose what belonged to him. The hospital room felt smaller now, as if the truth Alina had just spoken had taken up all the space, pressing against the walls, suffocating the fragile calm that had existed only moments before. Dante stood there, unmoving, his presence filling the room with a quiet intensity that made even the machine seem to hum more cautiously. His eyes didn't leave her, not Alina, not Arya. He was calculating not numbers or deals, but something far more dangerous: risk, exposure, consequence. Because whatever had chased Alina back into his world wasn't something ordinary. It was something that had forced her, after 20 months of running, to finally break her silence. Alina shifted slightly against the pillows, her strength clearly limited, but there was something in her gaze that hadn't changed. That same stubborn fire he remembered. The same woman who had once stood in his penthouse and told him she refused to become a weakness in his life. And yet here she was, proving she had always been the one thing he could never control. "I didn't want to call you," she said quietly, her voice trembling not with uncertainty, but with the weight of everything she had carried alone. "I promised myself I wouldn't, that I could keep her safe on my own." Her eyes moved to Arya, softening instantly, as if the child anchored her even in exhaustion. "But I was wrong." Dante's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that her words had reached him in a way he didn't allow anyone else to. "You should have called me the moment you knew," he said, his tone low, controlled, but beneath it was something sharper. Not anger, something deeper, something personal. "You don't disappear for 20 months and then decide you need help when it's too late." The words were harsh but not cruel. They came from a place he hadn't accessed in years, a place that still remembered what it meant to lose something that mattered. Alina closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of that truth, then looked back at him with quiet defiance. "It's not too late," she whispered. "They haven't taken her." The way she said it made the air shift again, colder this time, more dangerous. Dante's gaze sharpened instantly. There it was, the real reason, not fear of his world, not guilt, a threat, a direct one. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice dropping to something that carried authority without effort. "Who?" Alina hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't simple, this wasn't random. This was layered, calculated, and far more dangerous than she was ready to admit. "You know them," she said finally, her voice barely above a breath. "Or at least you know what they are." Dante's expression didn't change, but his silence invited her to continue. They're not coming with weapons, she added. They're coming with lawyers, with contracts, with leverage. They want her legally. Publicly, and if they can't get her that way. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Dante exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, deliberate. Now it made sense. This wasn't an attack, not in the traditional sense. This was strategy, corporate warfare at its most dangerous level, using what couldn't be defended easily. Reputation, legacy, bloodline. A hidden child wasn't just a secret, it was a weapon. One that could destabilize everything he had built if handled correctly or incorrectly. How did they find you? He asked, his voice quieter now, more precise. Because that question mattered more than anything else. Alina's fingers tightened slightly around the hospital sheet, a subtle movement but one that didn't escape him. I don't know exactly, she admitted. I was careful, I changed names, I moved constantly, I never stayed anywhere long enough to leave a pattern, I paid in cash, I avoided systems, I disappeared, Dante. Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness but from frustration. But a few weeks ago things changed. I started noticing the same faces, the same cars, subtle at first. Then not so subtle. And then yesterday, she swallowed hard, her eyes darkening with memory. Someone approached me. Dante's entire body stilled. What did they say? Alina looked at him, and for the first time since he had entered the room, there was real fear in her eyes. They knew her name, she whispered. They knew she was yours. The words landed with precision like a calculated strike. They told me I had a choice. Bring her to them quietly, sign what they put in front of me, or they would make it public. Everything. You, me, her. And they said if it went public, it wouldn't just ruin you. Her voice dropped further. It would make her a target. Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with something far more dangerous. Dante turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting to Arya, still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the storm gathering around her existence. His daughter, his heir, his vulnerability. And in that moment, something inside him changed, something fundamental, something irreversible. The man who had walked into this room thinking about Alina, about the past, about unanswered questions, was gone. What remained was something colder, more focused, more lethal. They made a mistake, he said quietly. Alina frowned slightly, confusion flickering through her fear. What do you mean? Dante looked back at her, and whatever she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. They think this is about control, he continued, his voice calm, almost too calm, about leverage, about contracts and headlines. He stepped closer, his presence consuming the space between them. They think they can use her to break me. Alina's fingers trembled slightly. Dante. They're wrong. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Because in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't something he was going to negotiate. This wasn't something he was going to manage quietly. This was something he was going to end. Completely. He glanced once more at Arya, then back at Alina, and for the first time since she had called him, there was no hesitation left in him. No questions. No doubt. Get some rest, he said, his tone final, controlled, absolute. When you wake up, everything changes. Alina's breath caught. Dante, what are you going to do? He paused at the door, his hand resting against the frame for just a second, and then he answered without turning back. What I should have done 20 months ago. And then he walked out, leaving behind not silence, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. By the time dawn began to break over the city, Dante Morty had already moved the world without anyone realizing it. The hospital corridors that had felt quiet hours ago were now subtly controlled, every entrance monitored, every exit accounted for, not by visible force but by precision. The kind of control that didn't draw attention, the kind that made people believe everything was normal while nothing actually was. When Alina woke again, the room no longer felt like a place of recovery. It felt like the center of something shifting, something far larger than her, than Dante, than even the truth she had revealed. Dante stood by the window, his back to her, the early light outlining him in cold definition. He hadn't slept. That much was obvious, not because he looked tired, he never allowed that, but because there was a stillness to him that only came when his mind was already 10 steps ahead of everything else. Alina watched him quietly, studying the man she once knew, searching for something familiar in the way he held himself, the way he carried silence like a weapon. But there was something different now. Not softer, never softer, just sharper, more focused, as if something inside him had finally found its purpose. "You shouldn't be here when they come back," she said softly, breaking the quiet, her voice steadier than she felt. Dante didn't turn immediately. He let the words settle as if measuring them, weighing them against something only he could see. Then slowly he faced her, his expression unreadable. "They're not coming back here," he said, not reassurance, not hope, a fact. Alina's brows drew together slightly. "You don't know that." "I do," he replied, his tone even, controlled but absolute. "Because I won't allow it." Before she could respond, the door opened. A woman stepped in, composed, professional, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of expression that belonged to someone who handled crises without flinching. She paused when she saw Alina awake, then gave a brief nod toward Dante. "Everything is ready." Alina's eyes shifted between them, confusion tightening her chest. "Ready for what?" she asked, her voice sharpening. Dante moved then, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. "You're leaving," he said. Alina blinked. "Leaving? With me?" The words landed heavier than they should have, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily he said them, as if there was no alternative, no other outcome worth considering. "Dante," she started, pushing herself up despite the exhaustion pulling at her body. "You can't just decide that." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, not raising his voice but cutting through hers with quiet authority. "You've been running for 20 months. It ends now." Alina shook her head, fear and frustration colliding inside her. "You think bringing us into your world makes this safer. Your world is the reason I left." Dante's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said calmly. "You left because you thought my world couldn't protect you." He stepped closer, his voice lowering, drawing her attention whether she wanted it or not. "That was your mistake." The words struck something deep, something she didn't want to admit. Because part of her knew he wasn't wrong. Part of her remembered the man who never lost, the man who controlled outcomes before they even existed. But this wasn't a deal. This wasn't business. This was her daughter. "And what happens when they come after us there?" she pressed. "What happens when your enemies realize she's real, that she's yours?" Dante's expression shifted then, not softer, not gentler, but something else entirely. "Something darker. They already know," he said. "That's why we don't wait for them to move first." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned slightly toward the woman by the door. "Bring her in." A moment later, the door opened again, and a nurse stepped inside carrying Arya, still half asleep, her small hand gripping the stuffed rabbit tightly. Alina's breath caught as she reached for her instinctively, pulling her close, grounding herself in the warmth of her child. Arya stirred, her eyes blinking open slowly, then settling on Dante. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just quiet curiosity. "You came back," she murmured softly, her voice still heavy with sleep. Dante's entire posture shifted just slightly, just enough that Alina noticed. "I said I would," he replied, his tone different now, quieter, steadier in a way that didn't belong to the man who ran empires but to something else entirely. Arya studied him for a moment, then reached out, her small fingers brushing against his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you taking us home?" she asked. The word hung in the air. "Home?" Alina's heart tightened. Dante didn't hesitate. "Yes." Arya smiled faintly, satisfied with that answer, and rested her head against Alina's shoulder again. But Alina wasn't looking at her. She was looking at him, at the certainty in his voice, at the way he said home like it already belonged to them. "Dante," she whispered, her voice fragile now, not from weakness but from the weight of what this meant. "You don't even know if I want that." He held her gaze, unshaken, unwavering. "You don't have to want it," he said quietly. "You just have to understand it's the only place they can't reach you." Alina's breath caught. "And if you're wrong?" For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not doubt, never doubt, something more dangerous than that. "Then they won't reach you," he said. There was a pause, a stillness that carried more weight than anything spoken before. "Because they won't exist long enough to try." The Morty estate did not welcome people, it absorbed them. As the black sedan passed through the iron gates, Alina felt it immediately, the shift from the outside world into something controlled, calculated, almost untouchable. High walls rose like silent guardians, cameras hidden in angles too precise to be accidental, security that didn't announce itself but existed in every shadow, every movement, every breath of the place. This wasn't a home, it was a system. A fortress built not just to keep danger out, but to eliminate it before it could even get close. And now, somehow, She and Arya were inside it. Dante stepped out first, his presence commanding the space before his shoes even touched the ground. The staff moved without being told, doors opening, eyes lowering, conversation stopping mid-sentence. Alina noticed the way they reacted to him, not fear exactly, but something close enough that it didn't matter. Respect built on power. Power built on certainty. He didn't look back at her immediately, but she knew he was aware of every step she took, every hesitation, every breath. Arya clung to her hand, her small fingers warm and trusting, her eyes wide as she took in the size of everything around her. "This is your house?" Arya asked softly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast entrance hall. Dante turned then, just enough for his expression to soften in a way that didn't belong to the man the rest of the world saw. "Yes," he said. Then, after a brief pause, his gaze flicked toward Alina before returning to the child. "Ours." The word landed differently this time. He didn't force it, didn't explain it. He simply said it as if it had always been true. Alina felt it settle somewhere deep, uncomfortable, complicated, impossible to ignore. Before she could respond, Dante was already moving, guiding them through the estate with quiet efficiency, his hand resting lightly against Arya's back in a gesture that felt instinctive, protective. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. Everything in this place bent around him. He led them to a private wing, separated from the rest of the house by a biometric door that opened only after a brief scan. Inside, the atmosphere changed, still secure, still controlled, but quieter, more contained. A space designed not for power, but for privacy. "You'll stay here," he said, opening the door to a large room filled with soft light, neutral tones, and an understated elegance that didn't try to impress because it didn't have to. Alina stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the space, the unfamiliar comfort, the careful design. "This is your room," she said, turning to him, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "It's the safest place in the house," he replied simply. She hesitated. "And you?" Dante's expression didn't change. "I'll be right outside." The answer was immediate, decided, final. Alina searched his face, looking for something, doubt, hesitation, anything, but found none. Arya, meanwhile, had already wandered toward the large bed, climbing onto it with the effortless trust of a child who believed the world would hold her. She placed her stuffed rabbit beside her and looked up at Dante again. "Are you staying too?" she asked. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in him again, small, almost invisible, but Alina saw it. "Yes," he said, "I'm not going anywhere." Arya seemed satisfied with that, curling onto the bed as if she had always belonged there. Alina watched her, her chest tightening with something she couldn't name, something caught between relief and fear, because this felt safe, too safe. And in her experience, safety like this always came with a cost. The moment fractured when the lights flickered. It was brief, barely noticeable, but in a place like this, nothing was accidental. Dante turned immediately, his entire body going still, his attention snapping toward the subtle shift in the system. A second later, a quiet, alert pulse through the room, soft, controlled, but unmistakable. Not an alarm, something worse, a warning. "Stay here," he said, already moving toward the door. Alina's heart jumped. "Dante. Don't open the door for anyone but me," he added, his voice low, absolute, leaving no room for argument. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, sealing the room in silence once again. But this time, it wasn't the same silence from before. This one was alive, waiting. Outside, Dante moved through the hallway with purpose, his mind already processing possibilities, variables, threats. By the time he reached the control room, Marco was waiting for him, his expression tight, controlled in a way that meant something was already wrong. "What happened?" Dante asked. Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing the central screen. Dante's eyes narrowed. The system hadn't been breached. It had been accessed. From inside. A single line of text blinked on the screen, clean, precise, impossible to ignore. "We know SHES there." For a moment, nothing moved. Then Dante's jaw tightened, something dark settling into his expression, something that didn't explode outward but folded inward, controlled, calculated, lethal. "They're not guessing anymore," Marco said quietly. Dante didn't respond right away. His gaze remained fixed on the message, on the certainty behind it, on what it meant. This wasn't pressure. This wasn't intimidation. This was confirmation. They knew. Not just about Alina. Not just about Arya. But where they were. And that meant one thing. There was someone inside his world who had already betrayed him. Dante exhaled slowly, his voice calm when he finally spoke, but colder than anything Marco had heard before. Lock the estate down. Marco nodded immediately, already done. Dante's eyes didn't leave the screen. Good, he said. Then his gaze darkened, something far more dangerous than anger settling into place. Because now, he continued quietly, this isn't about protection anymore. He turned, already moving back toward the room where Alina and Arya waited, his presence sharper, heavier, final. It's about finding who just made the biggest mistake of their life. The estate did not feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a trap, precisely engineered, perfectly controlled, and now undeniably compromised. The silence that followed the message was different from before. It wasn't heavy with memory or emotion. It was sharp, alert, waiting. Every corridor, every locked door, every quiet corner carried a question Dante Morty had not faced in years, who had crossed him from the inside. He walked back toward Alina's room with measured steps, but there was nothing calm about him now. The stillness he carried was not peace, it was containment. Rage, calculated and restrained, sharpened into something far more dangerous than chaos. Because betrayal, unlike competition, was personal. It meant someone had watched him, studied him, stood within his reach, and chosen to move against him anyway. Inside the room, Alina was no longer sitting. She was standing near the bed, Arya in her arms, her body tense, her eyes locked on the door the moment it opened. She had felt it too, the shift, the invisible line that had just been crossed. What happened? She asked immediately, her voice steady, but edged with fear she couldn't hide this time. Dante closed the door behind him, slower than necessary, as if sealing something in place. They're not outside, he said. They're already inside. The words landed hard, immediate, undeniable. Alina's grip on Arya tightened instinctively, her mind racing to catch up with what that meant. Inside your estate, she whispered. Dante's gaze didn't waver. Inside my system, inside my walls, inside my people. Arya stirred slightly, sensing the tension without understanding it, her small fingers clutching Alina's shirt. Mama, she murmured softly. Alina pressed a kiss to her hair, forcing her voice into calm. It's okay, she whispered, though her eyes never left Dante. It wasn't okay, not anymore. Dante stepped further into the room, his presence filling it completely, shifting the air itself. Tell me everything you didn't tell me before, he said quietly. Not a demand, not a threat, something worse, expectation. Alina hesitated, and that hesitation didn't go unnoticed. His gaze sharpened slightly, not with anger but with clarity. Now is not the time to protect anyone else, he added. If there's something you've been holding back, this is where it ends. Alina swallowed hard, the weight of everything pressing down on her all at once. She had spent months surviving by keeping things hidden, by choosing silence over risk. But here, in front of him, silence was no longer protection, it was danger. There's someone, she said finally, her voice low, fragile in a way it hadn't been before. Not just a rival, not just someone watching from the outside. Someone who knew about you, about me, about us before I left. Dante didn't react outwardly, but something in him stilled completely. Go on. Approach me weeks before I disappeared, she continued, her words slow, careful, as if each one carried consequences. Not directly, through someone else. Someone who said they could make things easier, safer. They knew too much, Dante, things I never told anyone, things only someone close to you would know. Her voice trembled slightly now, not from fear of him, but from the realization of what she was about to confirm. I thought it was coincidence. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. But then, I found out I was pregnant. Dante's jaw tightened. And everything changed, she whispered. The messages stopped being subtle, they became specific, controlled, like someone was guiding things, watching me, waiting for me to break. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with something that hadn't been there before, not just fear, understanding. I didn't just run from your world, she said. I ran because someone inside it was already looking for me. Silence followed. But this time it wasn't empty. It was precise. Dante turned slightly, his mind already moving, already connecting pieces, already eliminating possibilities. There were very few people who had access to that level of information, fewer still who would risk using it, and even fewer who would survive making that choice. Names, he said. Alina shook her head slowly. I never saw him, never spoke to him directly, but there was one thing, she hesitated, her breath catching slightly. They mentioned your board. That changed everything. Dante's gaze darkened, something colder settling into place. The board of Morty Global was not just a group of executives. It was the foundation of his empire. People who had built alongside him, who had earned their positions through loyalty, competence, or usefulness. If one of them had turned, this wasn't just a threat. It was a fracture at the core. Behind him, the door opened again without warning. Marco stepped inside, his expression sharper than before. Boss, he said, his tone tight, we've identified the breach point. Dante didn't turn immediately, and Marco hesitated just for a fraction of a second, enough to matter. It's not external, he said. It came from a secured executive channel. Alina's breath caught. Dante finally looked at Marco, his expression unreadable, but the weight behind it unmistakable. Which one? Marco held his gaze. There are 3 possible sources, he said carefully, all from your inner circle. The room went still. Not with fear, with realization. Because this wasn't just about Alina anymore. This wasn't just about Arya. This was about something far more dangerous. Someone who had been standing beside Dante Morty. Long enough to believe they could replace him. The moment Marco spoke, something shifted irreversibly in the room, as if an invisible line had been crossed and there was no returning to what existed before it. Dante Morty did not react the way most men would. He did not shout, did not demand answers, did not allow emotion to surface where it could be seen. Instead, he became still in a way that was far more dangerous, the kind of stillness that meant decisions were already being made, outcomes already calculated, consequences already set in motion. 3 names, 3 possibilities, 3 people who had stood close enough to him to learn the rhythm of his world and then chosen to break it. Alina felt it immediately, the shift in him. The man who had brought her into this place promising safety was still there, but something else had stepped forward beside him, something colder, something that did not forgive. She held Arya closer without thinking, instinctively placing herself between her daughter and whatever was about to unfold. Who are they? She asked quietly, though part of her already knew the answer would not bring comfort. Dante turned slightly, his gaze flicking to her, and for a moment there was something almost human in his expression, something that acknowledged the weight of what she was about to hear. Then it was gone. People I trusted, he said simply. The words were enough, more than enough. Alina's breath tightened in her chest because betrayal from enemies was expected, predictable, survivable. Betrayal from within was something else entirely. Marco stepped further into the room, his posture rigid, his voice controlled. The breach originated from a restricted executive network, he explained. Encrypted, layered, impossible to access unless someone with direct authorization allowed it. It wasn't a hack, it was a key. Dante's eyes darkened slightly. A key meant access. Access meant intention. And intention meant this had been planned long before Alina ever walked back into his life. Names, Dante said again, quieter this time but heavier. Marco hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but that hesitation carried weight. Victor Hale, he said first, head of corporate security, he's been with you for 12 years. Alina felt a chill run through her. 12 years, that wasn't an employee, that was loyalty, or at least it was supposed to be. Marco continued. Sienna Cade, chief legal advisor. She oversees all external contracts, acquisitions, and litigation strategies. Another pillar, another piece of the foundation. And then, after a brief pause, he added the 3rd name, and Alessandro Morty. The silence that followed was different from anything that had come before it. Alina's eyes snapped to Dante, her heart stuttering at the name. Morty, she whispered. Your family. Dante didn't answer immediately, but the shift in his posture said everything. Alessandro was not just family. He was blood, a cousin, a man who had grown up in the shadow of the Morty name, who had watched Dante build the empire from nothing, who had been given a place inside it not because he earned it, but because he belonged to it. Why would he, Alina started, but stopped when she saw Dante's expression? Because whatever answer she expected, he had already reached it. Because he thinks he deserves what I have, Dante said quietly. The words weren't bitter, they weren't angry, they were factual, controlled, and somehow that made them more dangerous. Alina shook her head slightly, trying to process the scale of it. So you're telling me that one of these people, someone inside your own company, has been feeding information about me, about Arya, to your enemy? Dante's gaze returned to her, steady, unwavering. Yes. And you don't know which one? Not yet. The answer should have been unsettling. It should have created doubt, fear, hesitation. But instead, it did something else entirely. It hardened the moment. Because the uncertainty wasn't weakness. It was a delay, a temporary one. Arya shifted in Alina's arms, her small voice breaking through the tension. "Mama, why are you scared?" she asked softly, her eyes still heavy with sleep but aware enough to feel the change in the air. Alina forced herself to breathe, to soften, to pull herself back from the edge of panic. "I'm not scared," she whispered, brushing a curl from Arya's forehead. "I'm right here." Dante watched the exchange silently, something flickering behind his eyes that no one else would have noticed. Not weakness, never that, something else, something far more dangerous than fear, purpose. He turned away from them slowly, his mind already moving ahead, connecting timelines, mapping behavior, identifying patterns. 3 names, 3 access points, 3 possible betrayals, but only one truth. "Lock down internal communications," he said to Marco, his voice calm, precise. "No one in the executive circle moves without my approval. No calls, no messages, no access to external networks." Marco nodded immediately. "Already in progress." Dante continued, his tone lowering slightly. "Bring them in one by one. No alerts, no suspicion. I want them thinking this is routine." Alina's chest tightened as she watched him. "Dante, what are you going to do?" He paused for a moment, just long enough that the weight of the answer settled before he even spoke. "Find out which one of them thought they could touch my family," he said quietly. Alina swallowed hard, and then Dante turned back to her, his gaze steady, unflinching, absolute. "Remind them why no one ever tries twice." The boardroom of Morty Global had never felt like a battlefield before, but tonight it was something far more dangerous than open war. It was quiet, controlled, polished to perfection in a way that hid the reality beneath it. The long glass table reflected the city lights like a mirror, and the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched out over the skyline as if the Empire itself was watching. Dante Morty sat at the head of the table, exactly where he always sat, exactly where no one had ever challenged him. But tonight, the air was different, tighter, heavier, because this wasn't a meeting, it was a test. One by one, they entered. Victor Hale came first, precise as always, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. A man who had built his reputation on loyalty and silence. 12 years at Dante's side. 12 years of trust that now meant nothing without proof. He nodded once as he took his seat, saying nothing, as if sensing the weight in the room. Then Sienna Cade followed, her presence sharp, composed, dressed in elegance that matched her mind. She offered a faint, professional smile, but her eyes moved quickly, assessing, calculating. She was the kind of woman who never walked into a situation without understanding it first. And finally, Alessandro Morty entered last, slower than the others, a faint confidence in the way he carried himself, as if the room belonged to him as much as it did to Dante. Blood had a way of creating illusions like that. The door closed behind them. No assistant, no staff, no interruptions. Just the 4 of them. Dante didn't speak immediately. He let the silence settle, let it stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, just long enough to force them to sit with it. Because silence, when controlled properly, revealed more than words ever could. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled. Sienna crossed her legs, her posture composed but her gaze sharper now. Alessandro leaned back slightly, too relaxed, too confident. That was the first mistake. "I called this meeting," Dante said finally, his voice calm, even carrying no trace of accusation, "because something inside my company has been compromised." No one reacted immediately, but Dante wasn't looking for obvious reactions. He was watching the details, the slight tightening of a jaw, the pause in breathing, the shift in eyes. Victor leaned forward slightly. "What kind of compromise?" he asked, his tone controlled, professional. Sienna's gaze flicked briefly toward Dante, then back to the table. Alessandro didn't move at all. Internal access, Dante replied. Restricted channels, information that should not exist outside this room has been shared. He let the words settle, let them echo just enough to force the truth into the open, even if no one spoke it. Victor's brow furrowed. That's not possible without direct authorization. Dante's gaze didn't leave him. I'm aware. Sienna leaned forward slightly now, her voice precise. Then either the system has been breached in a way we haven't accounted for, or someone with access made a decision. She didn't look at anyone when she said it. That was her strength. She understood how to say everything without saying anything. Alessandro smiled faintly. And that was the second mistake. Dante saw it instantly, the subtle shift, the confidence that didn't belong in this room right now. You find this amusing? Dante asked, his tone unchanged. Alessandro's smile didn't disappear, but it sharpened slightly. I find it predictable, he said. You built an empire on control, Dante. Eventually someone was going to challenge it. The words weren't aggressive. They were measured, intentional, and they carried something beneath them that no one else in the room seemed to catch immediately. Except Dante. Victor turned slightly toward Alessandro. This isn't the time for— No, Alessandro interrupted smoothly. This is exactly the time. His gaze shifted to Dante, steady, unflinching. You've spent years building something untouchable, but nothing is untouchable forever. Not companies, not power, not even you. The room shifted. Not with noise. With understanding. Sienna's eyes narrowed slightly, something clicking into place in her mind. Victor's posture stiffened, his instincts catching up to what Dante had already seen. But Dante didn't react. Not outwardly. He simply watched. Because now it wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about confirmation. You're right, Dante said quietly. Alessandro leaned forward slightly, his confidence growing. Of course I am. Dante's gaze didn't waver. But you made one mistake. The words landed differently this time, heavier, final. Alessandro's expression flickered for the first time, just for a second. Dante leaned forward, his presence shifting, not louder, not harsher, but undeniable. You thought this was about the company. Silence. The kind that didn't wait. The kind that ended things. It's not, Dante continued, his voice dropping slightly, each word controlled, deliberate. You didn't just touch my business. Alessandro's smile disappeared completely now. Dante held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no room left for misunderstanding. You touched something that belongs to me. The air in the room went cold. Victor's eyes widened slightly, realization hitting him all at once. Sienna's breath stilled, her mind racing through implications she hadn't considered before. But Alessandro didn't look surprised. He looked like he had been waiting for this. And what exactly is that? He asked quietly. Dante didn't hesitate. My daughter. The word landed like a fracture through the room. Not loud. Not explosive. But irreversible. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment the word settled in the boardroom, the balance of power shifted in a way none of them could pretend not to feel. It was no longer about corporate breach or internal sabotage or even control of an empire. It was personal now, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. Dante Morti didn't just protect assets. He eliminated threats. And the difference between the two was something only those closest to him ever truly understood, usually too late. Alessandro didn't look away. That was what made him different from the others. Victor had already leaned back slightly, distancing himself from the center of the storm, his loyalty recalibrating in real time. Sienna's expression had hardened, her mind moving faster than either of them, calculating consequences, strategies, exits. But Alessandro, he stayed exactly where he was, his gaze locked onto Dante as if this moment was something he had anticipated for a long time. I was wondering when you'd finally say it out loud, Alessandro said quietly, his voice steady, unshaken. There was no denial, no attempt to deflect. That alone confirmed more than any evidence ever could. Dante didn't move, didn't react outwardly, but something in him shifted into something final. So it's you, he said, not a question, not an accusation, a conclusion. Alessandro exhaled softly, almost amused. It was never just me, he replied, but yes, I opened the door. The room seemed to contract around those words. Victor's eyes snapped toward him, disbelief flickering through his otherwise disciplined composure. "You compromised internal access," he asked sharply. Alessandro didn't even look at him. "I corrected an imbalance," he said. "There's a difference." Dante leaned back slightly, studying him, not with anger but with clarity. "You sold information about my daughter," he said. Alessandro tilted his head slightly, as if considering the phrasing. "I leveraged information that you chose to hide," he corrected. "Let's not pretend you weren't the one keeping secrets first." The tension snapped. Not with sound, but with understanding. Sienna's voice cut in, sharp, controlled. "You gave Vescari access," she said. "Not just to company channels, but to something personal." Alessandro finally glanced at her, a faint smile returning, colder this time. "You say that like it wasn't necessary," he replied. "Vescari doesn't move without incentive. I gave him one." "And what exactly did you get in return?" Victor demanded, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the edge beneath it. Alessandro looked back at Dante. "Opportunity," he said. The word lingered. Dante's gaze didn't waver. "You think this gives you power?" he asked quietly. Alessandro didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "I think it gives me a future." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, more deliberate now. "You built everything alone. You kept control by never letting anyone close enough to challenge you. But you made a mistake, Dante. You created something too big to die with you, and then you tried to hide the one thing that could define what comes next." Dante's expression remained unreadable, but the room itself seemed to react, the air tightening, the silence sharpening. "My daughter is not a succession plan," Dante said. Alessandro smiled faintly. "No," he agreed, "she's leverage." The word landed harder than anything else that had been said. For a fraction of a second, something flashed in Dante's eyes, not loss of control, never that, but something far more dangerous, the acknowledgement of a line that had just been crossed beyond repair. "You involved Vescari," Dante said, his voice quieter now but colder than before. "You exposed her existence to someone who would use her publicly, legally, strategically." Alessandro didn't deny it. "He needed proof you could bleed," he said. "Now he has it." The silence that followed wasn't uncertain anymore. It was decisive. Dante stood slowly, the movement deliberate, measured, final. The others followed instinctively, not because they were told to, but because something in the room demanded it. Power didn't need to announce itself. It was felt. "You're wrong about one thing," Dante said. Alessandro's gaze sharpened slightly. "And what's that?" Dante stepped closer, his presence overwhelming now, not through force but through certainty. "You think this ends with leverage." Alessandro held his ground, but the confidence in his posture shifted, just slightly, just enough to matter. "It doesn't." Dante stopped just short of him, his voice dropping to something almost quiet. "It ends with consequences." Before Alessandro could respond, the doors opened. Marco stepped in, followed by two men from Dante's private security detail, their movements silent, precise, controlled. The shift in the room was immediate. Victor stepped back instinctively. Sienna didn't move, but her eyes tracked everything. Alessandro looked at them, then back at Dante, something unreadable flickering across his face. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Dante didn't react. "No," he replied. "You already did." Marco stepped forward. And in that moment, the corporate war ended. Because what came next wasn't business anymore. As Alessandro was taken from the room without resistance, without struggle, without another word, the silence returned. But it was no longer uncertain. It was resolved, controlled, final. Dante turned away, his mind already moving past this moment, past the betrayal, past the consequences that would follow. Because this was never the real battle. The real battle was already coming. And now his enemy knew exactly where to strike. The night did not end with Alessandro's removal. It began with it. The illusion of control that had defined Dante Morti's world for years had cracked, not shattered, not destroyed, but fractured just enough to reveal something far more dangerous beneath it. Because Alessandro had not acted alone, and more importantly, he had not acted blindly. Every move had been timed, every piece placed with intention, and the fact that he had been willing to sacrifice himself meant one thing Dante understood better than anyone else. The real play was still unfolding. Dante stood alone in his office, the city once again stretched out before him, but it looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The glass in his hand remained untouched, the amber liquid still as his thoughts moved rapidly beneath the surface. Marco's words echoed in his mind, the final detail that hadn't fit at first, the one piece that refused to align with the rest. Alessandro had opened the door. Yes, but he hadn't built the path, someone else had. Someone who didn't need access, because they had always been inside. The screen behind him flickered to life. Encrypted data streams, timestamps, internal logs, cross-referenced access points. Dante had spent the last hour doing what he did best, removing emotion, isolating variables, reducing betrayal to patterns. And now, finally, the pattern was clear, too clear. He didn't react immediately. He simply stared at the name. Sienna Cade. The door opened quietly behind him, but he didn't turn. He didn't need to. "You're efficient," he said calmly. "I expected you sooner." There was no response at first, just the soft click of heels against marble, measured, controlled. Then her voice followed, smooth, composed, exactly as it had always been. "I was hoping you'd take a little longer," she said. Dante turned slowly. Sienna stood near the doorway, not defensive, not nervous, not even surprised. Her posture was perfect, her expression steady, her eyes sharp with something that had always been there but never fully revealed. Ambition, not the kind that builds alongside power, the kind that replaces it. "You knew," she said, her tone not accusing but acknowledging. Before Alessandro said anything, Dante didn't deny it. "He was a distraction," he replied. "A loud one. You are quieter." A faint smile touched her lips, not warm, not kind, calculated. "You always underestimated quiet," she said. "No," Dante corrected. "I just never mistook it for loyalty." The air between them shifted, heavier now, more final. There was no pretense left, no reason for it. The truth had already surfaced. "You orchestrated everything," Dante said, not a question. Sienna stepped closer, her heels echoing softly in the vast space. "I guided it," she corrected. "Alessandro needed a push. Vescari needed a reason, you needed a weakness." Her gaze didn't waver, and she was perfect. The word hung in the air like something toxic. Dante's expression didn't change, but something inside him went completely still. "You've spent years building something untouchable," she continued, her voice calm, almost admiring. "But empires don't fall from outside attacks, Dante. They fall from internal fractures, from the one thing their leaders refuse to account for." She paused just slightly. "Emotion." Silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It was ending. "You exposed my daughter," Dante said quietly. Sienna tilted her head slightly. "I revealed what you were hiding," she replied. "There's a difference." "No," Dante said. There was no rise in his voice, no visible anger, just a shift. "A final one." "There is." Before she could respond, the door opened again. Marco stepped in. This time there was no hesitation, no delay, no uncertainty. Sienna's gaze flicked briefly toward him, then back to Dante. For the first time, something changed in her expression, not fear but realization. The understanding that whatever move she had been preparing, she was already too late to make it. "You think this ends with me?" she asked quietly. Dante held her gaze. "No," he said. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, undeniable, absolute. "This ends with anyone who thought they could use her." Sienna exhaled softly, something almost like respect flickering through her expression. "Then you should know," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "Vescari already made his move." The words landed like a delayed detonation. Dante didn't flinch, but something inside him shifted instantly. "When?" he asked. Sienna's lips curved faintly. "Tonight." The world didn't stop. It accelerated. Dante turned without another word, already moving, already calculating, already ahead of whatever was coming, because this wasn't over, not yet. Upstairs, Alina stood by the window, Arya asleep in her arms, the faint city lights reflecting in her eyes as unease settled deep in her chest. She didn't know why. She didn't know what had changed. Only that something had. The door burst open. Dante stepped in. And for the first time since she had known him, there was no calm in him. Only urgency. "They're coming," he said. Elena's breath caught. "Who?" Dante's gaze moved to Arya, then back to her, something fierce, absolute, and unbreakable settling into his voice. "Everyone." Outside, beyond the walls of the estate, the night was no longer quiet. It was moving. And this time it wasn't a threat. It was war.